There's anger in Egypt as a teenage girl died weeks after a street attack in the UK. Mariam Moustafa's family suggest that she was the victim of a hate crime. British police say there's no evidence that it was racially motivated, but such attacks are on the rise. Will we ever get to the truth? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. Police in the English city Nottingham say that 18-year-old Mariam Moustafa was followed by a group of girls, was verbally abused and then punched several times. She was treated in hospital and released, but later suffered a brain hemorrhage. She died in a coma 3 weeks following the attack. Detectives say that they're keeping an open mind, but there's no information to suggest that the attack was racially motivated. However, Mariam's family is not so sure. They're critical of the authorities in Britain, the police, the hospital and the government for their slow response. They say she'd been attacked by the same group last August. A 17-year-old arrested on suspicion of assault occasioning grievous bodily harm has been released on bail pending further investigations. Several other juveniles have been questioned.
I want to ask, where are human rights and where is democracy? We asked for CCTV footage. They said the cameras weren't working. We asked for witness accounts from the bus driver and the man who tried to help Mariam. And despite having witnesses, the girls who killed her are still free. Where are our human rights in this?
Well, before we bring in our guests and broaden out the discussion, I just want to bring in via Skype from Nottingham Clive Foster, who's a pastor and member of the Nottingham Citizens Leadership Group, who can tell us more about that city. Clive, good to have you with us on Inside Story. What are your thoughts on what happened to Mariam? Is this an isolated case? Does Nottingham have a problem with gangs, with bullying, with violent assault, with hate crime?
Well, first of all, I want to express my condolences to the family of Mariam. This is a really sad case and even more tragic in the circumstances in which this young person should lose their life. I want to say from the get-go that Nottingham is a very diverse and welcoming city, and on the whole, people get along together. As part of Nottingham Citizens, this is an organisation which is made up of churches, mosques, trade unions, universities and schools, ordinary citizens who come together and work for the common good. And we did a report in 2014, and that report unfortunately highlighted that hate crime was prevalent, that hate crime was underreported, and as a result of that, we took action to work with the local authority and with the police to ensure that increased resource would be placed into these institutions so we could have more effective reporting of hate crime, more understanding of hate crime.
So what are people saying there in Nottingham about what happened to Mariam?
Well, people are really upset that this could happen, on the streets of Nottingham. As I mentioned earlier, Nottingham is made up up to 35% of the citizens of Nottingham come from a diverse background. And people are really working hard to ensure that community cohesion is respected and that people respect and tolerate one another. So when this news broke, there was obviously real concern that this should happen in our city. And as I've said, as a city, we have taken measures to ensure that hate crime is properly recorded and to ensure that the communities as well understand that the authorities are taking hate crime seriously, both the police and the local authority, and that if any of these incidents happen, they should be reported and they should be dealt with satisfactorily.
And what are relations like between the community and the police force there in Nottingham? I mean, Mariam's family is suffering unimaginable grief at the moment, and in that grief have criticised the police response to what happened to Mariam. Is that criticism valid?
Well, this is an ongoing investigation, so I can't comment directly on that case. But what I can say is that as part of Citizens, we are actively campaigning to ensure, number one, that the police take this seriously, and they're committed to taking that seriously, and we hold them to account that they take that seriously. So we ensure that if anything happens, that they record such incidents as a hate crime. So that is an ongoing process that we scrutinise, that any incidents that happen, that they are reporting it and recording it publicly as a hate crime. Number two, that the public themselves, we have campaigns where we go out and we train people and teach people what is a hate crime. And also that you don't have to be a victim, but as a third-party onlooker, you too can report a hate crime, and that it should be recorded as a hate crime, and it will be investigated accordingly as well. And so there is ongoing work. We have a good relationship with the police, but it doesn't mean that we don't scrutinise them. It doesn't mean that we don't challenge them where we feel that there is failures within that. After all, Nottingham actually became the first city in the country and in the world to make misogyny a hate crime. And that was directly as a result of ordinary citizens, as part of Nottingham citizens, campaigning and challenging the authorities that we want to make this a hate crime.
Clive, really good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Inside Story.
Thank you.
Let's bring in our other guests on today's programme. From London via Skype, we're joined by Imam Abu Atta, Director of Tell Mama UK, a group that measures anti-Muslim attacks. From Leeds, Rose Simpkins, Chief Executive of Stop Hate UK. And from Cairo, also via Skype, Tim Caldas, a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Tim, we'll begin with you. I just want to ask you about the reaction to what happened to Mariam there in Egypt right now. The hashtag Mariam's rights will not be lost is trending there. Is that right?
Yes, that hashtag is featured quite prominently on social media right now. My personal social media timelines have been flooded with stories about her, and people are shocked and horrified to hear what happened to her, and that she eventually succumbed to her injuries and passed away. It's a tragic story of a young woman whose life was taken away far too early, and beyond that, people can relate to the idea of a family going abroad to try to give their children better opportunities. Mariam was studying engineering, and then that being cut short by this violence. But there's also a lot of concern amongst Egyptians that the case wasn't handled properly, both by the police and by the hospital. The family is claiming that 4 months prior to this attack, there was a previous attack that they reported to the police, and that nothing came of that report. And then also Mariam was taken to the hospital immediately after the attack and sent home a few hours later, telling her that she'd be fine, only to fall unconscious several hours later and come back and eventually be induced into a coma and come to pass away. So there's concerns about multiple parties failing to do what they should, and there's a lot of pressure from the public that this be properly investigated, and that the Egyptian government play a role.
Tim, if you read British newspapers, you could be led to believe that this has led to some sort of diplomatic spat between Egypt and the UK. I'm not quite sure it's got to that level yet, but the Egyptian government is involved. What is it they want from the UK authorities?
At the moment, they're demanding a thorough investigation, and they're demanding that the culprits who did this be brought to justice quickly. I think there's a risk that some people in the government will try to opportunistically leverage this to say that the UK isn't respecting human rights in Egypt as a way to deflect criticism of the human rights situation. The UK isn't respecting the human rights of Egyptians in the UK as a way to deflect criticism of the human rights record in Egypt. And hopefully that doesn't feature prominently in the conversation going forward. But overall, they're under a lot of pressure from the press and from the public to look into this very seriously. It's all over the Egyptian papers. BBC Arabic is covering it. And for the time being, if you look at foreign ministry statements, it seems like they're just very focused on it and hoping that the government in the United Kingdom takes it very seriously.
All right, Tim. Let's bring in Imam Abu Atta then in London. As Clive was saying a few minutes ago, Imam, we've got to be particularly careful that we don't prejudice any court action that arises as a result of this tragic case. What we can discuss is whether the attack against Mariam fits into a pattern, whether there are any similarities between what happened to her and the kind of cases that Tell Mama is dealing with.
Well, first of all, our condolences go out to Mariam's family and actually as well to the Egyptian people, and hopefully the investigation will reveal really what has happened. From the reports that we get into Talmama, the different reports that unfortunately currently with anti-Muslim hatred being on the rise, driven by many factors, starting from far-right narrative to terrorism, to the online world, to media headlines that fuel as well anti-Muslim sentiments in the UK. The range of reports that are coming to us can start from abusive behavior and in certain instances ending in physical violence and in some instances death. Unfortunately, as the case of Mariam is still under investigation, we don't know whether it's really driven by a racial motivation or a hateful motivation. It might be as well an element of bullying, given the age range of the young girls involved in this. But this is something that we don't see reported on a high level, or we don't see as reports coming into us into Talmama.
Iman, what's going on in the UK? UK police recorded some 80,000 hate crimes, from which 78% were based on race, 7% were based on religion in the last year. The number of race hate crimes increased some 27% from the 2015-16 year to 2016-17, and religious crime increased by 35% over the same period. What on earth is going on in the UK at the moment?
I mean, absolutely, and spot on. This is exactly a picture that we're seeing from Talmama. This is a picture that we're working with police forces across the country on. We had in 2016, in June, the referendum that shed a light on all types of racism, shed a light of allowing any thoughts that people had about not liking the other to come out in the physical world. Obviously, the campaigns on the referendum were not helping that cause, and therefore people were become more aware of what hate incidents are, what racism is, and came forward and started reporting any attacks they undergo. 2017, 5 terrorist attacks hit the UK. Rhetoric, we had the US elections that actually, well, the president came into office during that year. A lot of rhetoric of anti-Muslim hatred that is driven by far right in the online world as well as on a street level world. Again, combining that with terrorism, combining that with media headlines that fuel anti-Muslim rhetoric, with more awareness of people coming forward to report, we've seen really a rise in the number of hate crime that is recorded on a police level as well as on a Talmama level. And still, hate crime is underreported. So a combination of multiple factors is actually driving that hate, racial hatred or religious hatred within the UK. And we've seen recently as well, the Mayor of London has been under attack as well with hateful comments from far-right activists. And we've seen that social media companies are taking more responsibility in addressing this, although it's a bit late, but still they are upping their market in addressing this. We've seen that they've taken down a major far-right group's Facebook, which is Britain First, that had over 2 million subscribers to that page that is promoting hatred towards other community and specifically Muslim communities.
Let's bring in Rose Simpkinson, the Chief Executive of Stop Hate UK. Rose, how do you define what constitutes a hate crime?
Well, a hate crime is about whether somebody has been targeted because of their identity. So obviously we're talking about race and religion today in particular. So it's whether there was a motivation to say this is why the person was targeted. And so if you think that this was their motivation, or any other person thinks that it's their motivation, then it should be treated as a hate crime. It's really important to remember that a crime still has to take place. So it's not a standalone crime. So obviously it's assault or public order, or obviously in this case it could be murder. We don't know exactly what's going to come out of the investigations yet. But basically a crime has to take place, and we're looking at an aggravating factor. So do we think this was motivated by race is the question. Okay.
Rosa,
and obviously there are other forms of hate crime as mentioned.
Rosa, are hate crimes carried out at least statistically by one particular gender or ethnic group?
No, I mean, it depends on the different types of hate crime are carried out by many different people. And part of the problem, as has already been said, as Iman said, you know, most hate crime is not reported. So actually we only know about the alleged perpetrators or the perpetrators are the ones we know about, we know there are more that are unreported. So there could be whole groups of people that we're not even realising are perpetrators or indeed are victims. So the call is that people should report all forms of hate crime. When we're looking at really serious incidents, such as obviously the loss of life or serious injury, people are more likely to go to the police with those. What we often deal with at Stop Hate UK are things that are kind of the first steps towards maybe those sorts of incidents happening. So people coming to us at the very early stages of something doesn't feel right, I think I'm being targeted. And they're often the more difficult ones for the police to deal with. But what we're trying to do is stop the escalation. I mean, if you have a racist murder or a murder based on somebody's faith, it doesn't come from nowhere. There will always be a trail that takes it back to these sorts of incidents that a lot of people say, oh, well, that's what I have to put up with, or there was no evidence, or, that's every day for me. And that's what we're really concerned about, is how many people are suffering those everyday incidents and not talking to somebody. And obviously we're trying to prevent the escalation into the serious crimes of obviously loss of life.
Tim, we talked earlier about the anger there in Egypt about what's happened to Mariam in the UK. In terms of those everyday incidents that Rose was just talking about, I mean, we hear about attacks on ethnic minorities in Egypt, big terrorist attacks when they're targeted. But does Egypt have a similar sort of problem in terms of everyday racism and hate crime?
I mean, there are definitely issues of racism in Egypt. There's definitely sectarian violence, particularly that has targeted Christians and at times as well Shia or less often Baha'i, just because they're a much smaller group. So there are certainly incidents of that in Egypt. I think every society to some extent deals with discriminatory violence that would qualify as hate crimes. And the question is, do we document it properly? Do we acknowledge the problem? And do we take steps to prevent it? But yes, of course, it exists, I think, here and just about anyone.
Imam, we talked about the fact that hate crime is on the rise in the UK. There, I don't want to go into the particular reasons why right now, but what can be done to stop this alarming rise in hate crime numbers?
So on one side, we are asking people to report any incidents that they feel they've suffered from, whether they're racial, whether they're religious, whether they're based on their sexuality, on their disability, or the different characteristics that we all carry. So obviously, the more reports are coming, it's more giving us an indication of what's really happening in terms of community tensions. It allows us to address issues of concerns in terms of community cohesion between the different communities. Some of the drive behind the racial attacks and the religious attacks that are taking place in the UK are driven by far-right groups. That this is something that we're working with police forces and governmental officials to address, to be able to take down accounts that are fueling that hate, but also taking measures to address far-right extremism the way we address other types of extremism, because unfortunately extremism does fuel more hate crimes in Muslim communities. We also, we're working as well on ensuring that communities are aware on how they can work together on being upstanders in society against hate. So one of the things that we work on is really empowering the younger generation, educating the younger generation around what racism is, what bullying is, what discrimination is, what hate incidents would look like, and for them to be empowered to stand for other communities that would suffer such type of hatred and be able to put measures in place and help them to put measures in place to prevent that ignorance that communities usually have about the other, and by therefore be able to create more a community cohesion empowerment, whether it's projects or whether it's education projects that would be able to address the issues of racism, but also create that dialogue between the communities in the whole of the UK.
Rose, do the police in the UK take hate crime serious enough, particularly when it involves juveniles?
I think they do take hate crime seriously. I mean, we have some good policies, and part of why we have such high numbers of recorded incidents is because we're better at reaching out to get people to report. But there are still, I think some of the problems are around some of those early incidents that I talked about before, that often people report things where there's not really any evidence or we don't know what to do with it. And I think we're not always very good at engaging people to help them understand why nothing can happen at this point, but if we keep talking, we might get the evidence together. So I think there's lots to be done about those first ever reports, those first conversations, and so we're missing a lot of things because hate crime is often subtle in the early stages, and so I think we've just got to get better at understanding the risk of escalation, and also how, by dealing with people properly in that first conversation, they're more likely to come back when things start to escalate. And we don't want to wait till obviously the serious offences. So at Stop Hate UK, it is that, you know, how do you have that conversation with somebody who's distressed or angry or frightened, and when you can't give them the answers they want at that stage. But by keep talking, we are more likely to get to the point where the police can intervene or other agencies can intervene. And it is around how do you help people realise that, you know, around how cohesion and diversity is actually really good for us, but also how if you allow somebody else or another group to be targeted, then you are really basically also allowing yourself to be targeted. And you cannot condemn one other group and expect sort of safety and protection for yourself. We need to think about everybody's safety and everybody's rights, and build that cohesion and really work with communities to help them understand each other and also understand the real harm that hate crime does. And I don't think many people really understand the harm it does. People still say, oh, it's only name calling. Oh, it's only this or it's only that, it's only a bit of banter. And I think we need to understand, we need to call it what it is, and it is around hate, and we need to help people understand the harm and how we can all help protect each other.
Imam, what would your advice be to anyone who is the victim of hate crime, particularly young people, juveniles, who have enough pressures as well in their lives? I mean, heaven knows, growing up, you know, teenagers have all the social issues that are going on that they have to deal with. What would your advice be?
I mean, one thing definitely we urge young people to do is that if you feel that you were subjected to a race or hate incident based on your sometimes even based on your looks, based on your sexuality, based on your religion, based on your color, based on the language you speak, based on the accent. There's a lot that actually kids and younger generation pick up on and keep inside them and not talk about it. But if you feel that you're targeted for any reason whatsoever, please speak to an adult. Please speak to your teacher at school. Please seek out help and speak to someone you trust that would be able to escalate it further. I mean, we do run, again, sessions in schools, and we're happy to support young people. We have produced just now, actually today, before we spoke, a kind of a guide for young people that will go out on social media for them to actually be able to be supported in case anything happens. Do not keep it inside you. Please speak up. Please make sure that you're safe in case if you're subjected to an attack, and reach out for help. And in case of any emergency, please dial the police and call 999. All
right, there we must leave it. Many thanks indeed to all of you, Imam Abu Atta, Rose Simpkins, and Timothy Kaldas. And as always, thank you for watching. You can see this programme again at any time just by going to the website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, please join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the team here in Doha. I'll see you again. Bye for now.